Politics is the art of making decisions. Sometimes those decisions change the world for the better. Other times, they leave scars that last for generations, from billion-dollar policy failures to diplomatic blunders that redrew borders. History is filled with moments of miscalculation and poor judgment that historians still debate today. These weren't just mistakes. They were turning points, lessons in what happens when power meets flawed decision-making. Today, we're counting down 36 of the most consequential political missteps in history, examining what went wrong and what the world learned the hard way. Let's begin. Number 1. Prohibition, the 13-year experiment that backfired. Background. In 1920, the 18th Amendment banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol across America. Reformers believed it would reduce crime, improve public health, and strengthen families. The reality was dramatically different. Organized crime syndicates flourished, taking over the alcohol trade. Illegal speakeasies opened in every major city. Law enforcement struggled to enforce an unpopular law. Tax revenue from legal alcohol disappeared, while enforcement costs skyrocketed. The outcome: after 13 years, the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition in 1933. It remains one of the clearest examples of well-intentioned policy creating opposite results. The criminal networks established during this era persisted for decades. Punchline: sometimes the best intentions create the worst outcomes. Prohibition proved you can't legislate personal choices without consequences. Number 2. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, protecting jobs by destroying trade. Background. In 1930, as economic troubles began, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, dramatically raising import duties on thousands of goods to protect American industries. The event: over 1,000 economists signed a petition urging President Hoover to veto it. He signed it anyway. Other countries immediately retaliated with their own tariffs. International trade collapsed. American exports fell by more than half. The outcome: the tariffs deepened and prolonged the Great Depression instead of helping. Global trade didn't recover for decades. Economists point to it as a textbook example of protectionism gone wrong. Punchline: Congress tried to build walls around American jobs and accidentally trapped the economy inside. Trade wars rarely have winners. Number 3. The Iraq War, intelligence failures and their consequences. Background. In 2003, the Bush administration presented evidence that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed an immediate threat to American security. The event: the U.S. led an invasion with shock and awe tactics. Saddam Hussein's regime fell quickly. However, no weapons of mass destruction were found. What was planned as a swift operation became a complex, lengthy occupation. The outcome: the war lasted over 8 years and cost over $2 trillion. Regional instability increased rather than decreased. The decision remains highly controversial, with many questioning the intelligence that led to the invasion. Punchline: the cost of acting on flawed intelligence is measured in lives, treasure, and credibility. Verification matters. Number 4. Watergate cover-up, when the crime becomes the cover-up. Background. In 1972, operatives connected to President Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. The event: the burglars were caught, but Nixon and his advisors attempted to cover up the connection. They obstructed justice, destroyed evidence, and lied to the American public. White House tapes eventually revealed the president's direct involvement. The outcome: Nixon resigned in 1974, the only president to do so. Public trust in government plummeted. The scandal created a permanent suffix for political controversies: Gate. Punchline: Nixon was winning the election easily, but couldn't resist the cover-up. The attempted solution became worse than the original problem. Number 5. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, reopening settled questions. Background. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas proposed letting new territories decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty, effectively repealing the Missouri Compromise. The event, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas to influence the vote. Violence erupted between competing factions. The territory earned the name Bleeding Kansas as armed conflicts became common. The outcome: the act destroyed the fragile political balance, fractured existing parties, and accelerated the path toward the Civil War. A compromise meant to ease tensions inflamed them instead. Punchline: reopening settled debates rarely settles anything. Some compromises are temporary truces, not permanent solutions. Number 6. The Bay of Pigs invasion. Planning meets reality. Background: in 1961, the CIA trained Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro's government, assuming the Cuban people would support the invasion. The event: the operation was poorly executed from the start. The landing site provided little cover. Expected air support was canceled. Cuban forces were prepared and waiting. The invasion force was quickly overwhelmed. The outcome: the failure strengthened Castro's position rather than weakening it. U.S.-Cuba relations deteriorated further. The embarrassment for the Kennedy administration was significant, and it set the stage for future tensions, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. Punchline: assumptions don't win wars. Proper planning, realistic assessments, and adequate support. Number 7. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Escalation based on uncertainty. Background: in August 1964, President Johnson reported that North Vietnamese forces had attacked U.S. Navy vessels twice in the Gulf of Tonkin. The event: Congress passed a resolution giving the president broad war powers. American involvement in Vietnam escalated dramatically. Decades later, declassified documents revealed significant doubts about whether the second attack actually occurred. The outcome: the Vietnam War expanded based on uncertain intelligence. The conflict lasted over a decade, deeply divided the nation, and its legitimacy remained questioned throughout. Punchline: major military commitments require certainty, not assumptions. Once wars begin, they're difficult to end. Number 8. The Teapot Dome Scandal. When public resources meet private interests. Background: in the early 1920s, Interior Secretary Albert Fall secretly leased federal oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to private companies without competitive bidding. The event: Fall received substantial loans and gifts in return, essentially bribes. He transferred public resources to private interests for personal gain. Journalists eventually uncovered the arrangement. The outcome: Fall became the first cabinet member imprisoned for crimes committed while in office. The Harding administration's reputation was damaged. The scandal became the benchmark for political corruption until Watergate. Punchline: public resources require public accountability. Transparency exists for good reason. Number 9. The 2008 Financial Crisis Response. Too big to fail. Background: years of financial deregulation allowed banks to take increasingly risky bets. When the housing market collapsed in 2008, major financial institutions faced bankruptcy. The event: the government determined several banks were too big to fail and provided $700 billion in taxpayer-funded bailouts. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary Americans lost homes and savings. The outcome: banks recovered with government help, but many executives faced no consequences. The disparity between corporate assistance and individual hardship created lasting resentment and raised questions about economic justice. Punchline: when profits are private but losses are public, someone's playing by different rules. Number 10. The War on Drugs. 5 decades of unintended consequences. Background: in 1971, President Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number 1 and launched a law enforcement-focused approach to drug policy. The event: over 5 decades. The U.S. spent over $1 trillion on enforcement and incarceration. Mandatory minimum sentences filled prisons. Yet drug availability and potency increased rather than decreased. The outcome: the U.S. developed the world's highest incarceration rate. Communities were disrupted. The policy's effectiveness remains hotly debated, with many experts now advocating treatment-focused approaches. Punchline: treating public health issues as criminal justice problems rarely produces health solutions. Number 11. Citizens United. Decision, Money, and Speech. Background: in 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in Citizens United v. FEC that restricting independent political expenditures by corporations violated the First Amendment. The event: the decision allowed unlimited corporate spending in elections through super PACs. Political campaigns became increasingly expensive. The role of money in politics expanded dramatically. The outcome: election costs skyrocketed. Concerns about wealthy donors' disproportionate influence increased. Political advertising became a multi-billion-dollar industry. Debate over the decision's impact continues. Punchline: when free speech meets unlimited spending, not everyone can afford the same volume. Number 12. The Alien and Sedition Acts, Testing the First Amendment. Background: in 1798, fearing war with France and domestic opposition, the Federalist Congress passed laws restricting immigration and criminalizing criticism of the government. The event: the Sedition Act made it illegal to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing about the government. Journalists and opposition figures were prosecuted. The First Amendment faced its first major test. The outcome: the laws were deeply unpopular and helped the Federalists lose the 1800 election. Most provisions expired or were repealed. They're now considered a cautionary tale about sacrificing civil liberties during times of fear. Punchline: free speech is easiest to support when you agree with what's being said. The real test comes with disagreement. Number 13. The Compromise of 1877, Trading Rights for Power. Background: the disputed 1876 presidential election between Hayes and Tilden was resolved through a political deal. Hayes would become president if federal troops withdrew from the South. The event: Hayes took office. Reconstruction ended. Without federal protection, Southern states quickly implemented Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, and literacy tests to disenfranchise black voters. The outcome: the gains of Reconstruction were reversed. Segregation became institutionalized. It would take nearly a century and the civil rights movement to address these injustices. Punchline: political compromises that trade away human rights rarely age well. Number 14. The Chinese Exclusion Act, America's first restrictive immigration law. Background: in 1882, citing economic competition and racial prejudice, Congress passed the first federal law restricting immigration based on nationality. The event: the act banned Chinese laborers from immigrating for 10 years. It was repeatedly renewed and expanded. Chinese immigrants already in America couldn't become naturalized citizens. The outcome: the law remained in effect for over 60 years. Not repealed until 1943, it established a precedent for restrictive immigration policies and damaged America's international reputation. Punchline: building a nation of immigrants while excluding specific groups creates lasting contradictions. Number 15. The Hawley-Smoot Tariff, a sequel worth mentioning twice. Background: this 1930 decision was so consequential it deserves deeper examination. Congress raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. The event: trading partners retaliated immediately. Canada imposed tariffs on American goods. European nations followed suit. Global trade contracted by 2/3. American farmers who depended on exports were devastated. The outcome: the tariff worsened the depression worldwide. It took decades to rebuild international trade relationships. The lesson influenced trade policy for generations. Punchline: in an interconnected economy, isolationism isolates everyone, including yourself. Number 16. The Missouri Compromise repeal, breaking working agreements. Background: the 1820 Missouri Compromise had maintained an uneasy balance on slavery for 34 years by establishing geographic boundaries. The event, the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, repealed it, allowing territories to decide slavery through popular sovereignty. This broke a long-standing agreement that, while imperfect, had prevented escalation. The outcome: the repeal fractured political parties, created new ones, and accelerated sectional tensions. Within 7 years, the Civil War began. Punchline: working compromises, even imperfect ones, are better than broken agreements leading to conflict. Number 17. The Dred Scott Decision, the Supreme Court's worst ruling. Background: in 1857, the Supreme Court heard Dred Scott's case, arguing he should be free after living in free territories. The event: Chief Justice Taney ruled that black people, whether free or enslaved, weren't citizens and couldn't sue. The court also declared that Congress couldn't prohibit slavery in federal territories. The outcome: the decision inflamed sectional tensions, energized the abolitionist movement, and accelerated the path to civil war. It's universally considered the court's worst decision. Punchline: the court tried to settle a political question through judicial means and made everything worse instead. Number 18. The Hartford Convention, threatening unity during wartime. Background: during the War of 1812, New England Federalists opposed to the war met secretly in Hartford, Connecticut. The event: they discussed constitutional amendments to limit federal power and protect regional interests. Rumors spread of secession plans. Before they could act, news arrived that the war had ended victoriously. The outcome: the Federalists looked like unpatriotic opportunists. The party collapsed and never recovered. They became political outcasts. Punchline: timing matters in politics. Opposing a war looks different before and after victory. Number 19. The Bonus Army Response, how not to handle protests. Background: in 1932, thousands of WWI veterans marched to Washington requesting early payment of bonuses Congress had promised them. The event: they camped peacefully near the Capitol. President Hoover ordered military removal. Troops used tear gas and burned the veterans' camps. The operation was excessive for the situation. The outcome: public opinion turned sharply against Hoover. The incident contributed to his landslide defeat in the 1932 election. It became a symbol of government insensitivity during economic hardship. Punchline: how the government treats peaceful protesters reveals its priorities. Force isn't always the answer. Number 20. The Whiskey Rebellion Overreaction, sending an army for tax collection. Background: in 1791, the federal government imposed an excise tax on whiskey. Western farmers who distilled surplus grain protested violently. The event: President Washington assembled 13,000 troops, larger than the army that won independence, to suppress the rebellion. The overwhelming show of force subdued resistance before significant conflict occurred. The outcome: federal authority was established, but the response seemed disproportionate. The tax was unpopular and eventually repealed. The use of military force for tax collection set a controversial precedent. Punchline: establishing authority is important, but proportionality matters too. Number 21. The Indian Appropriations Act, creating the reservation system. Background: in 1851, Congress established the reservation system, designating specific lands for Native American tribes. The event: tribes were systematically removed from ancestral territories and confined to smaller, often less productive lands. Movement was restricted. Treaties were frequently broken or renegotiated unfavorably. The outcome. The policy created lasting economic and social challenges. Many reservations remain among America's poorest regions today. The system's legacy continues to affect Native communities. Punchline. Land policies that prioritize expansion over existing inhabitants create generational consequences. Number 22. The XYZ Affair, Diplomacy Through Humiliation. Background. In 1797, American diplomats traveled to France to negotiate peace. French officials demanded bribes before beginning formal negotiations. The event, the diplomats refused and reported back. President Adams released the correspondence publicly, replacing French names with XY and Z. American outrage led to an undeclared naval war. The outcome. The quasi-war lasted 2 years, cost millions, and achieved little. Adams eventually negotiated peace anyway. Public disclosure of diplomatic failures is complicated rather than a simplified resolution. Punchline. Sometimes successful diplomacy happens quietly. Not every negotiation benefits from public attention. Number 23. McCarthyism. Accusations without evidence. Background. In the early 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed widespread communist infiltration of government, military, and entertainment. The event, McCarthy held hearings, made accusations, and destroyed careers, often with minimal evidence. Fear of being labeled communist led to self-censorship. Thousands were blacklisted based on suspicion rather than proof. The outcome. McCarthy was eventually censured by the Senate in 1954. His tactics were discredited, but many careers and lives had already been damaged. The era became synonymous with baseless accusations. Punchline. Accusations are easy. Evidence is harder. One requires only words. The other requires truth. Number 24. The Patriot Act. Speed over scrutiny. Background. After September 11, 2001, Congress rushed to pass the USA Patriot Act in October. The 342-page bill passed with minimal debate. The event. The act significantly expanded government surveillance powers. Many provisions allowed data collection without traditional warrant requirements. Few legislators had time to read the entire bill before voting. The outcome. Years later, whistleblowers revealed extensive surveillance of American citizens. Courts ruled some provisions unconstitutional. Debate continues over balancing security and privacy. Punchline. Legislation passed in crisis often requires correction in calm. Hasty decisions have lasting implications. Number 25. The Iran-Contra Affair. Creative interpretation of congressional authority. Background. In the 1980s, Congress explicitly banned funding Nicaraguan Contra rebels. The Reagan administration sought ways around the restriction. The event? Officials secretly sold weapons to Iran and used proceeds to fund the Contras. The scheme violated both congressional prohibition and arms embargo policies. The outcome. When exposed, it became a constitutional crisis. Several officials were indicted. The affair raised serious questions about executive power limits and accountability. Punchline. When administration officials get creative with congressional restrictions, someone usually ends up testifying. Number 26. The Gulf War Incomplete Conclusion. Leaving Unfinished Business. Background. In 1991, after liberating Kuwait from Iraqi invasion, coalition forces had Iraq's military in retreat. The event, President George H.W. Bush decided the mission was accomplished. Kuwait was liberated. Coalition forces stopped short of Baghdad. Saddam Hussein remained in power. The outcome. Saddam continued oppressing his population and defying UN resolutions for 12 years. In 2003, the U.S. invaded again, this time removing Saddam. Whether finishing the job in 1991 would have been better remains debated. Punchline: half-finished military operations create complicated legacies. Clear objectives prevent unclear conclusions. Number 27. The Dust Bowl Policy Response Delay, when nature demands action. Background: in the 1930s, severe drought combined with poor farming practices turned the Great Plains into a dust bowl. The event. For years, federal response was minimal. Farmers were largely left to cope alone. Massive dust storms destroyed crops and homes. Hundreds of thousands became internal refugees. The outcome. Eventually, New Deal programs implemented soil conservation and provided relief. But the delayed response caused unnecessary suffering. The environmental damage took decades to repair. Punchline: natural disasters require immediate response. Delay compounds damage. Number 28. The Bradley Fighting Vehicle Development, when projects never end. Background: in the 1960s, the Pentagon initiated development of a new infantry fighting vehicle. The event. Over 2 decades, requirements continually changed. Politicians added features. The project's cost and complexity grew. What started simple became complicated. The outcome. The Bradley finally entered service in 1981, having cost $14 billion over 20 years. It worked, but the development process became infamous for inefficiency. Punchline: military procurement teaches an expensive lesson. Sometimes perfect becomes the enemy of good enough. Number 29. The Impeachment of Andrew Johnson, Politics over Governance. Background: after Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson clashed with Congress over Reconstruction policies. The event, in 1868, the House impeached him for violating the Tenure of Office Act, a law of questionable constitutionality created specifically to constrain him. The outcome: the Senate acquitted him by 1 vote. The impeachment accomplished little politically. Johnson remained president and continued his policies. The process consumed enormous political energy without resolution. Punchline: impeachment is a constitutional tool, not a political preference. Using it requires clear cause and likely success. Number 30. The Tuskegee Study, Ethics Failure in Medicine. Background: from 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service studied untreated syphilis progression in black men in Alabama. The event. Participants were told they were receiving health care but weren't informed of their diagnosis. Even after penicillin became available as a cure, researchers withheld treatment to continue observing disease progression. The outcome. The study ended only when a whistleblower exposed it. The government formally apologized in 1997. The study created lasting distrust in medical institutions, particularly in black communities. Punchline: medical research requires informed consent. Observing suffering you could prevent isn't science, it's cruelty. Number 31. The Sedition Act of 1918, criminalizing war opposition. Background: during WWI, Congress passed the Sedition Act, making it illegal to criticize the government, military, or war effort. The event: people were imprisoned for speeches, pamphlets, and private letters expressing opposition to the war. Socialist leader Eugene Debs received a 10-year sentence for an anti-war speech. The outcome: after the war, most provisions were repealed. Many convictions were later seen as First Amendment violations. The act is now considered a dark period for civil liberties. Punchline: suppressing dissent during a crisis often looks like overreach in hindsight. Number 32. The Election of 1876 Deal, Democracy by Negotiation. Background: The 1876 election between Hayes and Tilden was disputed, with 20 electoral votes contested. The event: political leaders negotiated behind closed doors. Hayes became president in exchange for ending Reconstruction. The deal was made without public input. The outcome: Hayes took office despite losing the popular vote. The compromise essentially traded away Reconstruction's gains for political resolution. The consequences affected racial justice for generations. Punchline: when democracy is negotiated in back rooms, someone's voice isn't being heard. Number 33. The War Powers Resolution Weakness: Checks without balance. Background: after Vietnam, Congress passed the 1973 War Powers Resolution to limit presidential military action without congressional approval. The event: the resolution required presidents to notify Congress within 48 hours of military action and obtain authorization within 60 days. However, it lacked strong enforcement mechanisms. The outcome: every president since has questioned its constitutionality. Military actions have occurred without explicit congressional declarations. The balance between executive and legislative war powers remains contested. Punchline: laws without enforcement mechanisms are suggestions. Constitutional balance requires both branches to respect limits. Number 34. The Camp David Accords follow-through: peace agreements need support. Background: in 1978, President Carter brokered historic peace between Egypt and Israel at Camp David. The event: the agreement was remarkable diplomacy. However, insufficient follow-through on Palestinian autonomy provisions left major issues unresolved. The outcome: while Egypt-Israel peace held, broader Middle East peace remained elusive. Unresolved issues continued generating conflict. The framework needed sustained implementation, not just signing. Punchline: peace agreements are starting points, not finish lines. Implementation matters as much as signature. Number 35. The underestimation of Al-Qaeda. Pre-2001, threat assessment failure. Background: throughout the 1990s, Al-Qaeda conducted escalating attacks: embassies in Africa, USS Cole in Yemen. The event: despite warnings from intelligence officials and the August 6, 2001, presidential daily brief titled, "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S. Preventive Measures Were Insufficient." The outcome: the September 11th attack succeeded. The intelligence community and policymakers had pieces of the puzzle but failed to assemble them. The consequences reshaped global politics. Punchline: threat assessment requires both gathering intelligence and acting on it. Information without action provides no protection. Number 36. The Mission Accomplished banner: declaring victory prematurely. Background: on May 1, 2003, President Bush landed on USS Abraham Lincoln to declare major combat operations in Iraq complete. The event: behind him hung a banner reading, "Mission Accomplished." The speech suggested the hard work was done. Media coverage celebrated the moment. The outcome: the deadliest years of the Iraq War came after that declaration. The insurgency intensified. The banner became a symbol of premature celebration and poor forecasting. Punchline: victory declarations work better after the victory is complete. Timing matters. And there you have it. 36 political decisions that teach valuable lessons about governance, leadership, and consequences. From well-intentioned policies that backfired to poorly planned operations and rushed legislation, history provides a masterclass in what to avoid. Some of these decisions came from fear, others from overconfidence. Many resulted from prioritizing short-term politics over long-term consequences. Which decision do you think had the biggest impact? Let us know in the comments below. Think there's an even more consequential decision we missed? Share your thoughts. Historical debate makes us all better informed. The key lesson: Good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. Careful planning, ethical considerations, and willingness to learn from mistakes matter enormously. Those who study history aren't doomed to repeat it, but those who ignore it often are. Thanks for reading. Stay informed, think critically, and remember, today's decisions become tomorrow's history lessons. Make them count.